not loved me yet.
Hi, I'm Lil.
And I'm Fitz.
And you're listening to Knock Once for Yes.
Welcome to episode 40, and we're lucky to be able to record at the moment as the UK seems to be continually battered by storms since last episode.
The wind has been howling and it has been so loud that it's been picking up on our microphones and we just haven't been able to cut the noise out.
I don't know if the weather has an effect on paranormal activity as well. We really need to start keeping a log to track it, because we've even had a little bit of activity at Coffee HQ again. I was going to say it's getting a bit warmer, but it isn't. We've just had another cold snap. It is, though, getting lighter in the evenings again, which should hopefully allow us to get a little bit more adventuring in.
Yeah, I can't wait to get out. It's been a long old winter. So Fitz, what have we got coming up on today's episode?
Coming up, we have an update on one of last episode's paranormal radar stories, as well as some haunted roads. We've got listener stories from Juliet, Renee and Caley. Lil has a paranormal encounter in a car park, and we take a ghost tour of Aston Hall in Birmingham on this episode's Paranormal Postcard.
But before we get stuck into all of that, we want to say a massive thank you to our latest patrons.
Laura Reed,
Rebecca Ditzler,
and Nicola Powell.
Thank you so much to all of our patrons and our supporters through Coffee, old and new. We just couldn't do this show without you. Your support is absolutely invaluable.
And our patrons will even have had a little sneaky peek of our road trip to this episode's Paranormal Postcard from Aston Hall. And for those of you that have seen it, we do hope you're enjoying our attempts at vlogging, and apologies again for the singing. All of our bonus content is available to every patron from just $1 a month.
And now, Fitz, I believe that you've got an update for us on last episode's Paranormal Radar story.
I do. On the last Paranormal Radar, we talked about an interesting photo captured at Lauriston Castle. I found it so interesting, in fact, that I decided to do a little digging. And sadly, what I found throws the authenticity of the photo into question. So, in the original story, the photographer was performing at an event at the castle and arrived early. The building was locked up, and he took some photos whilst waiting for someone to arrive to disarm the alarm and open up the building for him. He captured a photo that appears to be of a maid dressed in the stereotypical maid outfit of a dark dress, white apron and cap, standing in one of the windows. The figure appeared to have moved in successive photos, and the castle do not have any mannequins or cardboard cutouts. So far, so intriguing. But, and here is where I got a little disappointed, they do have reenactors, some of whom wear clothes very similar to, but to be fair, not exactly like the one in the photo. Someone with an investigative spirit got in touch with Lauriston Castle to ask if any of the reenactors were working at Magic Fest, and they were assured that they were not. However, there are photos from the event showing that there were indeed reenactors working the event in very similar costumes. There was even a picture of one stood watching Drew McAdam, the person who captured the ghost photo, performing at the event. So, Lauriston Castle staff clearly told a fib, and Drew McAdam certainly left out quite a relevant detail in the story. It does then seem that this may have been a bit of a publicity stunt. Unless someone comes forward to admit it, though, we may never know for certain. As I said, I couldn't find any pictures that showed the exact outfit, and the reenactors were wearing clothing that would have been worn by the maids during the period of the castle's habitation, otherwise they wouldn't have been very good reenactors. So it could still have been a ghost, maybe. For me, it would have been a lot more convincing if Drew had assured us that even though there were reenactors at the event in similar outfits, that they were yet to arrive, and for the castle staff, if again they'd admitted that there were reenactors present but that the person in the photo definitely wasn't one of their staff, I think that would have been more convincing than just not saying they were there in the first place. Missing off this vital information does seem to imply a hoax.
Yeah, it is a difficult one. I mean, from the castle's point of view, to be fair, I think their words were that none of their volunteer reenactors were working at the event. And that may have been true. I'm not saying it's an outright fib. The person dressed up in the maid's outfit may have been event staff instead of the venue's own volunteers. However, it's all a bit dodgy, isn't it?
Yeah, you kind of get the gist. If somebody says, oh, this picture that's been in the newspaper about the ghost, could it possibly have been one of your reenactor staff? And oh, no, the reenactors weren't there that day. Not like, oh, but we did have other people dressed up like that.
Yeah, like you say, they could have clarified by saying, no, there was definitely nobody in the building at the time. However, there were reenactors there. It's the way they've gone about it that makes it seem more like it's probably a hoax or a publicity stunt.
It's one of those annoying things where it looks too good to be true, and I think in this case it is.
It probably is, unfortunately.
Our second story is from Cambridgeshire Live and covers a topic we've spoken about a couple of times before on the show, Britain's haunted roads. As well as a few select stories such as motorists on the B3212 in Dartmoor reporting a pair of hairy disembodied hands grabbing the steering wheel of their car and attempting to run them off the road, or various accounts of phantom hitchhikers, or worse, people stepping out in front of their car only to disappear when struck. They also report on a recent survey by Select Car Leasing, which implies Londoners are the most likely to see a ghost on the road. They polled 1,000 people, and among the questions asked were, do you believe you've seen a ghost while driving before? Strangely, 36% of Greater Londoners responded either strongly agree or somewhat agree, with the figures for the rest of the country being approximately 10 to 15%. I wonder what it is about Londoners that they apparently see more ghosts on the roads. Is it just there are more ghosts in London? Or is there something in the water, as it were? Interestingly, 34% of respondents overall believed in ghosts, so there's a fairly healthy number of believers in the UK if you extrapolate nationwide. I do find it quite interesting that there do seem to be some very common themes with road ghosts. Other than the hairy hands of Dartmoor, which was a new one to me, the phantom hitchhiker and disappearing pedestrian ghosts are strangely common, and often reported in the same places. Another thing that it brought home to me was that we're a bit naff at naming roads in the UK, amongst other things. No Route 66 or Sunset Boulevards for us, oh no. We end up driving down the A422 to Upton Snodsbury alongside the gentle waters of Piddle Brook, which isn't quite as romantic. And just in case you think I'm making that up, you can Google it. The A422 does indeed pass through Upton Snodsbury and cross Piddle Brook. It's not far from Worcester. What we are good at, however, is ghost stories, and I believe that you even have a car-related ghost story for us.
I have indeed, and I've been very lax because this happened just before Christmas, and I keep forgetting to share it on the show. In fact, it was because of an episode, it was the Christmas episode, we were getting close to recording it, and we were pulling a bit of a late-nighter. We pulled up a few late-nighters before Christmas, getting that episode ready, to be fair. And on one of those nights, we needed some snacks, because you do on these sort of late-night writing sessions. So I went up to our local supermarket, and it was very late. It was near closing, probably, going on 11 o'clock at night. And I was one of only 2 cars in the car park. So I was parked right in front of the supermarket, which I never get to do because it's always rammed. And there was one other car, clearly full of youngish lads blaring music right over the other side of the car park. So I went in, got my stuff, came back, and I was just checking behind me, and I was about to reverse, kind of got everything in gear, and I was doing my last check before moving backwards. And I saw, and not just saw, but also heard and felt somebody run right behind my car. And when I say right behind, I mean so close they actually bumped the car. It was like they'd sort of misjudged the distance and bumped it with their hip as they went past. I saw this, just flash of a black figure shooting past my rear window, and it was really fast. I heard the accompanying footsteps because they were that close and, resounding on the concrete. And I felt my car move as whoever it was just moved the car with their force and motion. And of course, it really made me jump because I was about to reverse. I checked, there was nothing there, and I was about to reverse. I was just sort of turning back again. And I was like, oh my, goodness, I nearly plowed down a pedestrian. It gives you a fright, doesn't it? But so I looked round to obviously check where this pedestrian had gone so I didn't hit them. There was nobody. There was absolutely nobody. The lads in the car with music hadn't moved. There was nobody. Well, there was nobody anywhere. It was 11 o'clock at night, just before Christmas, in a small town where not much happens.
Yeah, the land's all flat. There's nothing in the car park that they might have been able to hide behind.
It's completely open. I mean, you can see the whole extent of the car park from where I was sitting. You can see everything. There's nowhere they could have gone in that time. But the fact that I felt it, I felt and heard the running. It was a person. Well, I was convinced it was a person until, there was nobody there. It was very strange. Now, this is not an old place.
No, it was farmland. It's now a supermarket, and I don't think it's ever been anything else. So there was never a road there before.
No, I can't imagine anybody has come to any harm there. It's only been there for a few years, not long. It's quite a recent build, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I don't know where that could have come from. Now, I kind of want to go down the road of ancient land because I know that when they were building that site, they found Roman artifacts there. They actually found some quite interesting Roman artifacts there. And I think there was a Roman well around the area. So there was sort of settlements around on the land. But I mean, I heard footsteps on tarmac and whatever it was interacted with my car. And unfortunately, as much as I wish it was a Roman haunting, that doesn't speak to me of something ancient. That's something modern interacting with the modern environment.
Yeah, definitely. Weird. Not sure we'll ever make sense of that one.
No, me neither.
Maybe we'll have to camp out in the car park with a camera and see if we can catch it again.
Yeah.
But until then, I believe it's time for our first story, and this one is from Juliet.
In 2014, I returned to the big island of Hawaii and the small community of Waimea to stay on Parker Ranch lands. Parker Ranch was the largest operating cattle ranch in the United States for years, but it's now been changed into a real estate development company. There are, however, things that one cannot change, as I was to find out the first month I was there. I brought my cat, Batman, to a nice house in a gated community surrounded by tall grasses, occasional fences, a few trees, and quite a few horses. The house, in the complex of single-family dwellings, sat closest to the volcanic mountain of Mauna Kea, where there are numerous telescopes sitting up at the elevation of 13,000 plus feet, the size of the mountain towering over the entire landscape. This did not mean that we were actually close by the mountain, rather that there was nothing on the landscape between the back lanai and the initial sloping of the volcano for miles. So I could say that I lived under the volcano, inhabiting another novel space far away from Mexico. The area was desolate between the lanai and the mountain. There were maybe 2 or 3 structures used to contain farming equipment, which I didn't know about until some firebug set them ablaze, and the resultant fire threatened to burn the gated community should the wind's direction change. There were Hawaiian homelands to the far left of the lanai, but they were also at least a mile away. The gated community had homes that sat too close together, and yet they felt strangely apart. And we had one neighbour who made it her business to turn in people whom she felt were not following the association rules. A more miserable person you couldn't meet, obviously caught in some incredible web of having too little to do. The other side had a rather lovely lady who planted tea leaves around her home because she felt something was there. I knew nothing of these dynamics when I arrived. I just knew we were rather isolated and lived in an extremely quiet community. When the sun went down, the clouds disappeared and everything was bright with stars. There was no light pollution, so you could easily see the constellations in the sky. I spent the first few days unpacking and arranging myself. I slept with the window open by my head. The weather was cold at night, so different from Oahu's balmy tropical weather. Here I was 3,000 feet up from the ocean. Batman was apoplectic. He sat by the window staring at the birds that congregated by the lanai. After 2 weeks, I was more at home. And then early one morning, I was awakened to the sounds of people chatting and laughing through my bedroom window. It wasn't really loud. It sounded like people moving around and talking, and there was a strange bell that seemed to be like a wake-up call. I turned over and fell back asleep. I thought that maybe someone in a house a little further away had set his alarm for 3:30 a.m. But then it happened again the next night, only it was a bit more loud. Or was it? I thought that one of the house members had set an alarm to rise early. It was 3:30 a.m. again. When I went out of my room, there was no sound. I went back to sleep. It was bothering me. I was awakened again a few days later. The sounds were close by, but I couldn't make out the words. There were words and that bell. I wanted to tell them to party elsewhere, so I walked out to the lanai. It was 3:30 a.m. again. But as soon as I was outside on the lanai, the bells stopped. I mean, there was nothing. No sound. No light from a gathering over in the Hawaiian homelands direction. And I began to doubt that I was actually hearing anything. I asked around the community, did they have an odd alarm bell? Did anyone rise at 3:30 a.m? My neighbour with the tea leaves didn't question what was happening, but I did. I felt like I was being messed with. I felt like someone was checking me out. And I felt like there was a strong male presence. I wasn't hearing female voices. It continued. I got up at 3:30 a.m. Other times I just turned over after a trip to the bathroom. Then one Saturday I was buying vegetables from the local farmer's market and I mentioned the waking bell story. I left out the voice part because by that time I was feeling like I was hearing things and I didn't want to have gossip be spoken about me. I told the farmer's wife about the wake-up bell and asked her if she knew of farms around here that may have them. I told her that it happened at 3:30 a.m. When she heard that, she paused. She asked me where I lived and then told me that the area where the Parker Ranch Paniolos, that's the Hawaiian cowboys who tended the cows and steer, had lived just next to our gated community. In fact, some of the structures had been moved from there and placed in town to clear the area for the development. The wake-up bell at 3:30 a.m. had been used to get them up and ready to go out into the ranch. She told me that I was just hearing sounds that happened a long time ago, that the old cowboys were just reluctant to leave Parker Ranch. That was one explanation, but I was sure there was a more cogent one that relied more on the here and now. The sounds were too lifelike. The area was so vast, and maybe with the strong trade winds that swept across the dry lands, sounds could be carried from far away at night. So whenever I was thinking about it, and the intensity of the alarm bell was waning, I wasn't getting up at 3:30 a.m. with the sound of the alarm after several months. I would take a drive to see where the cattle might be. What other ranches were there, out by, say, Waikiki? I was heading to Hilo one Saturday and I took the shortcut through Waikiki. There were two fellows by their horses near the road. They were ranch hands of sorts, so I pulled over and asked them if there were any ranches around there that had a wake-up bell that they use. When I got a quizzical look, I asked them how they managed to rise early for work. One of them pulled something from his back pocket and pointed to the screen. It was an iPhone. It was a total bust. I could not find any reasonable answer for the bell, and I looked everywhere. I did also have a hair-raising event when walking to the mailboxes one night from the house after 10 p.m. I felt someone walking with me. It was so real, I sprinted back. I told my stories to the Hawaiian groundskeepers, and they just nodded. They told me that there are 3 graves on the property, one near our house, the other by the horse paddock where we collect the mail. I decided that I would plant tea leaves outside my bedroom window.
And thank you to Juliet for sharing that story. I'm really impressed with the lengths that she went to investigate. I was going to say try and prove or investigate that,
definitely.
to see if she could get to the bottom of it.
That is seriously a true investigative spirit, and that is absolutely to be applauded.
And just for your records, Lil spent pretty much the whole afternoon researching how to pronounce all the Hawaiian words, so we hope that we did them justice. There
were a couple that I couldn't find anywhere, so I'm sorry if any of them are mispronounced, but it was fun learning a lot of words that I didn't previously know. But I love the part where she asks, "But how do you rise so early in the morning?" Because that is absolutely something that I would do. And then for him to produce the iPhone, I did have a little bit of a chuckle.
Yeah, there's a little mini paranormal blooper in the story as well. That was really good.
Now, in my ignorance, I must admit I haven't heard anything about these tea leaves. And for those of you who haven't read the script like I have, that is T-I leaves, not T-E-A leaves as it might sound. But I'm guessing from what Juliet says in her story, they're planted to sort of ward off spirits or negative spirits or something like that.
That's the impression I got. I must admit I was thinking T-E-A-T. And I was like, I've never heard of tea being used as a sort of protective thing before.
No, it's T-I, so it's a plant that I've not heard of, obviously not native to Britain. But yeah, that's a really interesting one. So if anybody knows more about these tea leaves and the tradition behind planting it, then let us know, get in touch, because it'd be really interesting to find that out. So thank you again, Juliet, for sharing that awesome story. And our next story is from Renee.
My first paranormal encounters happened during my freshman year while spending time in Riddenbow Hall. Riddenbow Hall is the oldest brick building on campus, constructed in 1902 as a women's dormitory. It was designed in the Renaissance Revival style by architect Willis Ritchie, and has been on the National Register of Historic Places since 1977. After the hall was no longer used as a dormitory, it was annexed by the College of Letters, Arts and Social Sciences, with the first floor used as an art gallery, and the second and third floors as music practice rooms and School of Music faculty offices. Due to its age and location, it's naturally the centre of many paranormal stories, some verified and some most likely fantastical. A cellist is said to have died on the third floor. A little girl was reported to have died in the basement, and a young woman supposedly hung herself in room 225 in the 1930s. I wasn't able to find any news reports substantiating these stories, but this does not necessarily rule out the possibility that some or all of these instances did occur. There have been many reports from the custodial staff about their experiences whilst caring for the building. Many were more common occurrences, such as fingerprints reappearing on freshly cleaned windows when no one else was in the building, footsteps running up and down the stairs, doors shutting, and pianos seemingly disappearing. In an interview with the school newspaper, one of the custodial staff shared a personal encounter. The staff member was quite fond of a beautiful tigerwood piano in one of the rooms on the third floor, dubbing it My Piano. One day she went to check on her piano and found it missing. Suddenly, she heard furniture moving in a locked room on the second floor and went to investigate. As she unlocked the door, she found that she had to shove past some resistance to open it, and there found her beloved piano. She also mentioned that the activity in the building heightens when stress levels are running high for students, such as during midterms, the Christmas season, and near concert time. As a young music major, I would spend much of my time in Riddenbow Hall practicing. Not always able to fit these practice hours in during the day, I may or may not have snuck in through an unlocked window on the first floor to get some extra practice in after the hall was locked for the evening. There was no alarm system, and it wasn't too difficult to wiggle in as long as the hedges were trimmed. I would like to add that I was far from the only student to do this, and the university finally installed an ID card access at the back of the building that allowed music majors to swipe in after the main doors had been locked during my junior year. My most memorable personal experience in the hall happened on one of the nights that I and a friend had used the window as access to the building. We were on the second floor when we heard footsteps coming up the stairs from the first. Expecting to find another student on a late-night practicing mission, we waited where we were, down the hallway from the landing, to see who it was. We soon realised that there was no one there once the footsteps reached the top of the stairs and paused. Suddenly, a rushing blast of cool air whipped past us and down the hallway, almost like the sweeping of skirts. My friend and I took one look at each other, decided we didn't need the extra practice that badly, and promptly left the building. Other than this one rather forceful encounter, I always had a general sense of unease the further down in the building I went. The first floor always made me feel a bit uneasy, and I would often rush or run out the front door as I left, day or night. A group of friends and I decided to poke around and see what we could discover in the basement, but I wasn't able to make it more than halfway down the stairs due to an overwhelming feeling of dread. It wasn't until years later that I learned of the reported death in the basement. I often heard movement and playing down the hallway or above me during my after-hours practice sessions, but now I wonder who or what was really there with me. The second major paranormal encounter I experienced while a student puts me in the Haunted House Club. I moved into the Elysian apartments with my dear friend and her adorable Shetland sheepdog Sydney in 2005. The complex had run through several owners and names by the time we moved in and was in varying states of disrepair. But it was the only complex that allowed pets that was also in our meagre price range. The complex was originally opened in October of 1948 to accommodate the influx of students on the GI Bill and their families after the end of World War II. Before the construction of the complex, the site housed 150 trailers and surplus buildings from the campus of the Manhattan Project B in nearby Hanford, Washington, which we used as a vet village until the permanent structures were built. The experiences my roommate and I had didn't begin until we'd settled into the apartment for a few months. Many of our experiences were physical in nature and centered on the kitchen and dining areas. Up to this point, I'd heard Sydney bark one single time. He was one of the sweetest, most calm and loving animals I'd ever met. I'd definitely never heard him growl or seen him bare his teeth. One evening, as the three of us were on the couch watching television, Sidney whipped his head to the dining area and produced the most menacing guttural growl I'd ever heard. His teeth were fully bared. We both suspected someone outside had aroused his response, but could find no cause for his behaviour whatsoever. It was as if he was looking at someone sitting at our kitchen table, but no one was there. This continued on a fairly regular basis until the activity began to be more physical. One day I came home to a fairly rattled roommate who told me that she'd been cleaning the kitchen. She left the room to redeposit the cleaning supplies in the hall closet, and when she returned, every single cabinet was perfectly opened 90 degrees, a la Sixth Sense. It's important to note that these particular cabinets could in no way fall open by themselves. Original to the facility, they were either Raymond Loewy or Sears Homart steel cabinets with a fastening system that locked the cabinet door in place and required some force to open and close as they were quite stiff. A few days later, we were both in the kitchen prepping a meal when we heard a crashing noise above the range. We were both standing within a foot of the range since it was a rather cramped kitchen and were baffled. Absolutely nothing had fallen, and there was nothing cooking in the oven that could have made any sort of noise. I flung a dish towel in the general direction of the noise, for who knows what reason, dish towel to the rescue, and we decided we were done with food prep for the night. After my roommate moved out a few months later and another moved in, I was home alone studying in my room when I heard a huge crash. It sounded as if the metal shelving we used to hold our canned goods and other foodstuffs had come crashing down, and I expected to walk into a huge mess with cans flung this way and that. When I went to assess the damage, not a single item was out of place, and I could find no source of the crash whatsoever. As suddenly as the activity had started, it seemed to subside. The final experiences with the apartment involved the basement to the unit, which was used as a ramshackle storage area for old appliances and furniture. There were also wood and chicken wire storage units you could rent for any surplus belongings. It was only technically accessible from a door on the outside of the building, which was left open and unlocked at all times. But our unit had a hole in the floor of the closet which housed the water heater and our vacuum, and you could see directly down into the space. A prime example of the state of disrepair the complex was in. One evening, as I was pulling the vacuum out, I looked down the hole and saw someone sleeping on one of the couches. Startled, I did a double take, and the person was gone. This could have easily been a trick of the eye, but combined with the uneasy feeling I got when I was down there, deciding if the storage lockers were worth the expense, they weren't, and the feeling of being watched, I didn't immediately dismiss it. I suppose it could also have been a living person, but I don't see how they would have been able to silently slip out of the door so quickly. Eventually, I graduated and moved out, but I'll never forget my rundown apartment with the extra roommate.
Thank you so much for Renee for sharing those fascinating experiences with us. And can I just say, dish towel to the rescue! Love that bit. Again, I can just imagine myself doing that. It's an automatic reaction, to be fair. You're protecting yourself with whatever you've got to hand, flinging a dish towel into whatever whatever it is that's scaring you. Seems perfectly logical to me.
Yeah, just as logical as hiding under the duvet.
More so, I think.
Yeah, more so. You can get a good crack with those dish towels on, can't you?
Those can be quite dangerous, actually. You can get a good whip with them. They can be pretty vicious, dish towels can. And the other thing I wanted to say was the big crash that she heard. And I mean, I could see in your face, even as you were reading it, Fitz, that resonated with you. It's something that we've experienced.
Mm-hmm.
But it's something that crops up so many times, often in poltergeist cases. And I know that we've talked on several of those poltergeist cases in the show before. I'm trying to think of the specific one I'm thinking of, but I think it was like a 16th, 17th century case. And it wasn't described as like food cans because they didn't have them. It was described as sort of, I think it was like they thought the chimney had fallen down or something like that. That they thought that the chimney stack had like collapsed or something because it was such a crashing sound.
Yeah, when we had it, it sounded like someone was tipping over bookcases and throwing televisions on the floor and really loud bang, crash, smash. And like she was saying, you expect to go in and just see
a disaster
zone. And no, everything just in its place. There's no real reason why you should have heard the noise.
But I just found it so fascinating that it's something that crops up in modern ghost stories, and it's something that, you know, we have in the culture of ghost stories now, but it dates back so far. We found it in centuries-old ghost stories as well, and classic hauntings from, like I say, 16th, 17th century. And the noise is described slightly differently because obviously they didn't have the same items that we have today. But essentially, the noise is the same. It's this noise of crashing, of destruction. And the people writing even hundreds and hundreds of years ago are saying they're walking into the room expecting to see just devastation. And there's nothing.
Yeah, so strange. So yeah, some cracking stories. I really enjoyed reading those. Thank you, Renee, for sharing them with us. And now it's time for our final listener story of the episode, and this one is from Caley.
When I was 7, my parents split up, and my father moved back to the UK. My mum wanted to provide me the opportunity to decide with whom and where I wanted to live, so I went to visit my father and stayed for a couple of months. Unfortunately, my father and I have a very difficult relationship. He didn't have the time to see me, so I was sent to Wales to live with my grandmother instead. Her house was a rather old 2-storey townhouse overlooking the Welshpool countryside and with an insanely steep staircase. My grandmother was a bit of a hoarder, so the rooms were filled with trinkets and junk that littered the stairs and the hallway towards my room. I was usually sent to bed around 7 p.m, but I would secretly stay up reading my comics, as I knew my grandmother would be sleeping in her chair in front of the telly. Most nights you would hear heavy footsteps slowly coming up the stairs. Thinking it was my grandmother, I quickly turned off the light and pretended to sleep. It occurred most nights, and I believed it was her going to bed. One night, however, I heard the footsteps slowly make their way up the stairs and head towards my door, which was across the hall. My door had one of those old-school, small, black round door handles high on the door panel, and it started jiggling as if someone was struggling to open the door. Thinking it was my grandmother, I got out of bed, opened the door, and there was no one there. Just the dark hallway. Being only 7, I freaked out, ran back to my bed and hid under the covers. After that night, I would hear the footsteps walking up the stairs and stopping outside my door. I hated going to bed and tried explaining to my grandmother about it, but she said I was being silly. A few months later, I experienced a rather traumatic event and was gladly sent back to Australia to my mother. And here is where my story truly begins. My childhood home here was built in a new suburb, and even now is only 24 years old. There's no history on the land that I'm aware of, and my experiences didn't occur in that house until I moved back from the UK. My mum had to work several jobs to keep us going, so I was often left at home alone. I would be asleep in my bed upstairs, and every now and then I would hear this loud banging from downstairs, as if someone was opening and slamming the kitchen cupboards repeatedly. and things would always go missing, especially teaspoons. There was always this feeling of being watched in my house, and an extremely dark feeling in my father's old room. It was that bad that I refused to go in there for many years, and at night, as it was the first room on the landing upstairs, I would run past it as fast as I could. One day, it was unusually cold, so I brought up the courage to grab my school winter blazer, which my mum had stored in the wardrobe of my father's old room. Whilst I was in there, a mattress leaning up against the wall that had been there for over 5 years untouched fell down flat against the floor. I ran out of the house and waited for Mum to come home before going inside again. Mum never seemed to notice anything. She was a staunch Catholic, so I don't think she liked to believe that the paranormal existed. Though one night, whilst I was asleep, she woke me up and started yelling at me for repeatedly running up and down the stairs. I was dead to the world asleep, and I've never been known to sleepwalk, so I had no clue what was going on. She later apologised and never brought it up again until she heard footsteps several years later whilst I was at a friend's house. During my teens, I was given a German Shepherd for my birthday, and we were inseparable. She would follow me everywhere. However, she was always hesitant to go into my father's old room and would always be on guard whenever we were upstairs together. I remember one night watching TV in my room, and she stood at my door growling before turning into a full-on barking session. I was quite scared, but tried to put it off, as maybe there was someone walking around outside. We lived on a corner block, and she loved barking at other dogs walking past. There was one night in particular that I will never forget, and it still scares me today. My dog had come down with a paravirus and had to spend several days at the vet's. During this time, I was home alone. Went to bed as usual, but woke up sometime during the night. Well, I think I was awake. It was strange. I could see my room as normal, but I couldn't move. All I could do was watch as this large black shadow came through my doorway and approached my bed. As it got closer, I felt like I had hands digging into my shoulders and forcing my body back into bed. It was horrible. I could see this face. It was a man's face, but it was orange, appeared to be melting off, and black holes where his eyes should have been. It was horrible and felt like an eternity. But it stopped. I woke up, and it was like nothing happened. I refused to sleep in my room for 2 years after that, and made sure I always had my dog with me. After that final incident, I grew terribly depressed and irritable. It was like my whole personality had changed, and I remained like that for several years after seeing psych after psych and being put on antidepressants. It wasn't until a friend who was quite spiritual recommended I see a woman for spiritual healing that this heaviness lifted. Now, I don't know if it was some sort of PK manifestation, extreme negative attachment that I brought back from the UK or whatnot, but it certainly opened my eyes to the paranormal. I work as a microbiologist, so I'm fairly scientific-minded when it comes to these sorts of things, and I cannot give any explanation to what occurred during my childhood. I currently live with my partner in a new home in another city. Strange things still occasionally happen, but nothing to that extent. If anyone can give me an answer as to why my teaspoons still keep disappearing, my partner would be grateful. He's sick of buying a new set every year.
And thank you again to Caley for sharing that story with us. I know exactly what you mean about the teaspoons. We have exactly the same problem with forks.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. We just lose forks. We keep having to buy new sets. It's not like we're throwing them away or something.
No,
I don't know where they go.
We're both very particular with our forks as well.
We are. We have our favourite forks. So although we have sort of forks from about 4 different sets. I only like one kind. Fitz only likes one kind. So sometimes we just can't find our favourite forks. It's very sad. It's really interesting that the activity in her home didn't start until she'd got back from the UK. Thought that was curious, especially as it was a newer house. So did she bring something back with her, or was it that she was more aware and sort of open to experiencing activity? Because some people, they can live in a notoriously haunted house, or they can visit a notoriously haunted house, and they will experience nothing. It's just like they're completely closed off to it. They won't notice anything. They won't feel anything. So sometimes it's almost like an event in somebody's life, a particular paranormal experience, then opens them up to many more experiences. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I was wondering whether it could have been something to do with the divorce and the sort of, again, as you say, the sort of emotional disruption of that.
More like how sort of a classic poltergeist case where children experience something traumatic and then it's almost their energy that sort of sparks something. That could also be the case.
Yeah, there was a lot of interesting stories in there. The first one was sort of your classic
haunted house.
And it reminds me very much of my dad's childhood home. I used to hear somebody walking up the stairs at night. And, terrifying. But Kelly, I think, was looking for potential options for what some of it might be. And the one where she was in bed and she didn't think she was asleep, she may have been, and that could have been sleep paralysis. Not that I'm saying it is. No,
we don't know, obviously. I know sleep paralysis. I've had sleep paralysis myself. I've talked about it before, and it is horrible. You're not quite sure if you're asleep or awake, but you can't move. So you can sort of see the room around you, but you can't move. When I've had it, I haven't had any sort of visions or hallucinations or anything like that with it, but I have read that is possible.
No, I've felt like there's something just outside my view or something like that.
Have you, when you've had it?
There's something coming to get me. I just can't see it, or it's behind me, or... But yeah, I have that feeling that something's there.
I haven't experienced it like that myself. Whenever I've had sleep paralysis, it's during a period of high stress. And all that happens for me is that I wake up, well, I think, half wake up. My brain and my eyes wake up, but the rest of my body doesn't, so I can't move. And it kind of feels like you're being pinned in the bed because none of your muscles are awake and they're not working. And it is absolutely terrifying. It's just awful. It's the worst feeling ever. And like I say, I have read that other people have also had visions alongside that, and that can apparently happen with sleep paralysis, although I haven't experienced it myself. So it's a possible explanation. We're not saying it is that, because obviously, Kaylee's had lots of other stuff going on as well. That's got to be borne in mind. If other stuff is happening in conjunction with this, it completely puts a different slant on it, especially because her dog was quite obviously reacting to a presence or something paranormal.
Yeah,
and it was the one night the dog wasn't there.
Yeah, the only reason I brought it up in the first place was because she said, and then I woke up.
Yeah.
Which made me think, well, possibly that's an option. But yeah, the fact that, as you say, that it was on the night when the dog wasn't there was a very interesting...
But it is worth talking about sleep paralysis. Whether or not this was the case, obviously we can't say, possibly not. But just for anybody that's not aware of sleep paralysis, if you don't know what it is, when you have it, it is horrendous. So we will always bring it up just to make people aware that it exists, because when I first experienced it, I didn't know what it was, and it is just, it's the worst feeling. Knowledge is power. If you know what it is you're experiencing, it's a tiny bit better.
Yeah, it's still terrifying, but if you can go, it's just sleep paralysis, I'm going to be able to move in a minute, I'm going to be able to do whatever I need to do any minute.
It can help you get through it.
So thank you once again to Kaylee, and thank you to everyone that shared their stories with us on this episode. It is your true paranormal stories that make this show. So please, if you've got a story to share, get in touch through our website at knockOncevs.com. We would love to hear them. And now it's time for our latest paranormal postcard adventure. And just be warned that there are a few grisly deaths in this one.
For this episode's Paranormal Postcard, we decided to do something a little bit different. As many of you will know, we generally do most of our visiting during daylight hours, just like any regular tourist would. There are a few reasons for this, the biggest of which is that we've both seen far more apparitions during the day than we ever have at night. But of course, another big reason is that it can be difficult, expensive, or even impossible to visit locations after dark. So just occasionally, if we stumble across an opportunity to see a building during its twilight hours when the shadows come out to play, it's very tempting to jump at the chance. And that's exactly how we ended up going on a ghost tour of Aston Hall in Birmingham. We've not yet really started to explore Birmingham from a paranormal point of view. In fact, before this ghost tour popped up in my newsfeed, I'd never even heard of Aston Hall. So when I started looking into the place and discovered that there was a huge and very haunted Grade 1 listed Jacobean mansion nearby, and that they were offering nighttime tours trimmed with all the ghost stories, I was sold.
I imagine that coming upon Aston Hall even in daylight hours is a bit surprising. This massive, sprawling 17th century pile is like an island of the past, stranded slap bang in the middle of the most urban environment you can imagine. So many of the historic houses that have survived to the present have done so exactly because they're tucked away from big cities and industrial environments. They have parkland and countryside to protect them from the encroaching urban growth. They haven't been knocked down to make way for shopping plazas and car parks because they are outside the city limits. So Aston Hall is rare in having managed to survive in the middle of a very densely built-up part of Birmingham, and coming upon it in the dark is even more of a shock. We get no far distance glimpses that we're getting close, just one sharp turn off from a regular city street, flanked by industrial parks, and all of a sudden, there it is, looming up at us from the darkness, as though we accidentally took the exit off the 21st century rather than the M6. Once we've parked on some very soggy grass that has me hoping I won't end the night trying to push the coffee-mobile out of the mud, we're pointed towards a not very obvious entrance that, in the dark, we walk past a couple of times before realising that's our way in. The mystery didn't stop there either, as once into the dark courtyard there were no signs as to where we were supposed to go, and no clue as to where we were supposed to be meeting our tour group. Although being a little frustrating, and not to mention a little bit fresh under the clear sky of a February night, it was a good opportunity to have a bit of a sneak around the back of the property and soak in all the atmosphere of the building by the light of the full moon. When we'd eventually found our way into the cafe and discovered where we were supposed to wait for our guide, we quickly warmed up, picked up a guidebook, and then had our first disappointment of the evening as we were told that we wouldn't be allowed to take pictures during the tour. As you can imagine, this is a bit of a blow for us, and although there's always a risk when visiting a new location that cameras won't be allowed, we'd seen so many pictures and videos of Aston Hall on social media during our initial research, including some from nighttime visits, that it was a bit of a surprise. Of course, I can understand that it completely kills the mood to have cameras flashing all the way through the tour, although many places get around this by having separate allotted time for people to take photos. But tonight there was unfortunately no concession for this. However, a huge, dark and spooky mansion was waiting for us just the other side of the courtyard, so we couldn't let our spirits be dampened for too long. When our guide came to collect us, we were brought across the courtyard and around the side of the house to approach the front entrance by the large circular front drive. The dark house reared up into the night sky until you could barely see its outline in the blackness, except for the seemingly hundreds of softly lit windows glowing down on me like so many eyes, watching me traverse the noisy gravel. With so many windows glaring down from all angles, it was hard not to feel watched, and equally as hard not to expect a fleeting shadow to skitter across one of them. I felt as if I stood here long enough, that's exactly what I would see, but although I avidly watched the windows for signs of movement, I saw no phantom faces peeking out of the glass. Soon we were led out of the chilly night and into the great hall, where we were confronted by a stern portrait of the man behind the house, Sir Thomas Holt.
Thomas Holt was the High Sheriff of Warwickshire at the end of the 16th century, and by the beginning of the 17th, he was knighted by King James I. Holt had a reputation, not just for being one of the wealthiest landowners of the area, but also for being obsessed with status and power, and for his violent temper. In fact, one of the local legends I heard about Aston Hall, even before our visit, was the rumour that Holt had attacked his cook in a fit of rage and split his head in two with a meat cleaver. Whether he really did such a deed is unknown, but it is known that his neighbour accused him of such, and in return, Holt sued the neighbour for slander. This was not a man you wanted to be on the wrong side of. He was so determined to be above the rest of his peers that he bought the newly invented title of baronet in 1611, one of only 200 such titles that the king was selling to raise funds. Holt didn't care that he bought instead of earned the title. It raised him to a higher status than the other wealthy landowners, and now all he needed was a house fit for a baronet, and so, in 1618, he began to build Aston Hall. After 17 years, his statement of wealth and power was finally finished, and he must have gone some way to succeeding in his intention, as a contemporary of the time described Aston Hall as a noble fabric for which beauty and state much exceedeth any in these parts. But despite the hall's noble beauty, and despite Holt's wealth and power, life at Aston Hall was far from happy. Many of his children died young, and the ones who survived he feuded with relentlessly, disinheriting his son for choosing to marry outside of his wishes. He even went so far as to remarry in an attempt to father another boy so he could completely cut off his eldest son from any inheritance. His new wife did bear him a son, but in the end, Holt outlived him, just as he outlived all but one of his 16 children. Despite Holt's best efforts to the contrary, the Hall did somehow manage to stay within the family line for over 100 years, only passing out of Holt ownership in 1782. After passing out of family hands, the Hall had a bumpy few years, being passed from pillar to post. Some owners ran out of male heirs, some fell to financial ruin. It was rented for a time to James Watt Jr., son of the celebrated inventor. But after his occupancy ended, the hall sat empty, its uncertain fate echoing around the empty corridors, even as much of the parkland it stood within was eaten away by the growing city. And we might have lost it forever at this point, were it not for an enterprising group of locals in 1858 who formed the Aston Hall and Park Company. Despite not having enough money to buy Aston Hall outright, they had a plan, and their plan was to pay off the debt of their purchase by letting the park for public entertainments. And it's here that we arrive back in the chilly Great Hall, where we are introduced to the first character of our ghost tour, a lady tightrope walker by the name of Selena Powell.
Queen Victoria herself opened the park at Aston Hall with her full blessings, but only a few years later, tragedy struck. Selena Powell was born into a family of performers, and her tightrope walking was the work that supported her mother, her husband, and their 7 children. Even being 7 months pregnant with their 8th child didn't stop her from taking to the high wire. But sadly, on a July evening of 1863, she fell from the wire and was grievously injured. The story goes that she was carried into Aston's Great Hall with the hope of bringing her medical attention. But she was too badly hurt, and mother and child passed away, right in the space where our group is now huddled. Many think that it's Selena's spirit that leaves visitors to this room with a feeling of being watched, and staff wonder whether she is responsible for the unexplained slamming of doors in the area. Some have even reported the eerie sound of crying. But if it isn't Selena causing this phenomena, there is apparently another possible culprit who prefers to haunt the Great Hall. It seems every old pile has a resident lady in grey, but Aston has a lady in green. Guests in the Great Hall have reportedly encountered a lady in a green dress who they were convinced was a member of staff in costume, until, that is, she turned and disappeared through the wall. This apparition has been attributed to one of Thomas Holt's housekeepers named Mistress Walker, who, by all accounts, ruled the roost with an iron fist and hated mess. It's not explained to us at the time why the Green Lady is thought to be the housekeeper, and our guide admits that she hasn't been seen in the hall in recent years. But when I started my own research into the phenomena, it seems there was a bit more to the story than he let on. It turns out the lady in the long bottle green 17th century dress has been seen in recent years, but not necessarily in the Great Hall, where we were introduced to her. She is in fact more often seen on the upper floors of Aston, in the servants' quarters and particularly in the nursery and the housekeeper's room, which suddenly made a lot more sense. There is even a contemporary report from a member of staff who encountered the lady whilst locking the rooms on the upper floor one night. Understandably, they thought at first that she was a stray visitor, until they realised that the lower floors had been closed for some time. There was no way for a visitor to have reached this floor, and then they recognised the bottle green 17th century dress and realised with a start that they had seen the famous Green Lady ghost. We, however, were being beckoned to our next destination, and so we shuffled out of the chilly hall towards the similarly named Great Stairs.
As we all came to rest at the bottom of the stairs, the tour guide asked if we had all heard the tales of a secret tunnel that ran from Aston Hall to the local church. I hadn't, but I wasn't surprised. Most stately homes, castles, churches, any significant buildings of a certain age, really, are reputed to have secret tunnels running underneath them. And the reason that there are so many of these rumours everywhere you go in the country is because at one time there were quite a few secret passages around. Many of these were to hide people at risk of religious persecution, and some were used for smuggling. But we are informed unequivocally by our guide that there are in fact no secret tunnels connecting Aston Hall to the church or anywhere else. At the time, I wondered why he felt the need to state this quite so strongly. But in my later research, I found there is a persistent local legend that such a secret passage does exist, starting in a small hidden room under the Great Stairs and leading not to the local church, but to another room somewhere in the hall. The story goes that when the hall was first opened to the public in the 1800s, visitors used to be able to explore the tunnel, and this interesting quirk of the building formed part of the tour of the house. However, one day not all of the group made it back from their tour, with one lady mysteriously absent from their group. They hunted high and low for the missing woman, and eventually she was found in the secret passage, where she had been murdered. After this heinous crime, the passage was blocked off and struck from the tour, although you can still see where it began, in a small cupboard under the great stairs, cleverly hidden by a large, ornately carved oak chair which, while it appears to rest innocuously against the wall, is actually a secret door to the cubbyhole and swings away from the wall in proper Scooby-Doo fashion. Curiously, we weren't shown this exciting secret door, nor were we told of the local legend, which seems very odd to me. Even if there is genuinely no evidence of a secret passage, I would have thought that this was a morsel worth sharing, especially as the rest of the tour was quite light on stories specific to the house. What's even weirder is that upon inspecting the guidebook after our visit, there's a black and white photograph of the cubbyhole under the stairs. The chair cum door swung open to reveal a small cupboard with a very realistic skeleton sitting in it. The label under the photograph reads, "Secret cupboard under the Great Stairs, circa 1900. And that's it. There's no other explanation, no mention in the entire rest of the book about the cupboard or the secret door or why on earth there's a skeleton sitting in the cupboard. I mean, it may have been a joke, but as the photograph was supposed to date from the 1900s, I wouldn't think they had an abundance of plastic joke shop skeletons sitting around. And what a peculiar thing to just drop into a guidebook with no explanation why. So I contacted Aston Hall and asked them about it, referencing the specific page of the guidebook. To their credit, they did get back to me, but only to reiterate the legend we'd heard from the guide of the secret passage to the church, also stating that it was unfounded and the small doorway under the great stairs was just a cupboard. But there was no mention of the local legend I'd come across, of a passage leading to elsewhere in the house, or the murder of a visitor. Now, of course, I'm not insisting that there's any truth to the legend. It just seems odd to me that a tour, basically otherwise written around local legends, would choose to skip this one so entirely and so vehemently. And as to the skeleton in the photograph, they replied that it was a popular practical joke by museum attendants in the 80s and 90s. I questioned them again, asking whether they were referring to the 1980s and 90s, as the black and white photograph was labelled circa 1900. So whilst I'm sure they're right, and that putting a fake skeleton in the cupboard may well have been a popular practical joke in the 80s and 90s, that doesn't necessarily explain this much older photograph. There's another photograph towards the front of the guide, also labelled circa 1900, and the museum attendant in it is sporting a quite obviously Victorian or Edwardian uniform and moustache. To my last question, they never replied, leaving me even more confused. There may be nothing to it at all, but it all just felt a little off.
As we were huddled around the base of the Great Stairs, we were told the story of one of the most famous of Aston's ghosts, the ill-fated servant Dick, whose story is so well known that one of the attic rooms is popularly called Dick's Garret. Apparently, Dick was a young street urchin who was caught pickpocketing, but instead of being handed over to the authorities, he was brought to Aston Hall and put to work as a servant, which, though not an easy life by any means, was probably a better fate than being left to the tender mercies of the correctional system of the time. Unfortunately, though, his time as a servant was short-lived. Either they kept their servants pretty hungry at Aston, or he couldn't change the habit of a lifetime and was once more caught in the act of thievery, this time stealing a loaf of bread, and was hauled before Sir Thomas Holt, who gave the instruction to lock Dick in his room whilst he considered his punishment. Holt's reputation as a volatile, angry and violent man was well known, and so Dick spent the next 3 days of his confinement frantically worrying about what would befall him. None of the possible consequences for stealing were much better than another. Prison, deportation, being put in the stocks, all were horrific options. And in the end, or so the story goes at least, Dick decided he couldn't bear any of the possible outcomes and sadly took his own life, hanging himself in the servants' quarters in the attic. It seems that this terrible event left its mark on the attic rooms, as apparently one of Aston's caretakers has seen the unfortunate boy swinging apparition in the old servants' quarters on several occasions.
During the storytelling, my eyes were wandering everywhere the tour guide wasn't, as is my way. I'm always looking for things moving that perhaps ought not to be. And I thought I'd done just that. From my position at the bottom of the stairwell, I could see up through the banisters of the landing on the next level up. And there was a shadow moving. The first time I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but, paying more attention now, the shadow moved again, darting across the dimly lit space from right to left. A few moments later, at the story's climax with Dick hanging himself in the attic, a thick, heavy rope ending in a hangman's noose suddenly dropped down in front of our unsuspecting group, making us all jump. Immediately, I wrote off the moving shadows I'd just seen. The rope was dropped from a landing above, so the shadow I saw must have been cast from a person opposite the landing I'd been looking at, who had thrown the rope down. With that explained and feeling slightly misled and disappointed, we all tramped off upstairs to the next room, the ancient floorboards on the bare wooden stairs making a deafening cacophony of creaking and groaning as we went, and as they continued to do during every traverse across the landings and up the several flights of stairs we would encounter that night. This racket was something I noticed but didn't think much more about at the time. But later, when I was telling Fitz about the shadows I'd seen, it suddenly took on more meaning. As we started on the stairs towards the landing where I'd seen the shadow, I realised that this was not where the rope had been thrown from after all. From this point, I could now see up the rest of the high stairwell, which went up for at least another 2 floors, and the rope went all the way up with it. Now, the rope didn't swing as it came down, it just dropped straight down, which would imply that it was dropped from the top floor where it originated. But if that was so, who was casting a shadow on the landing above us? It was after hours, so there was only the limited tour staff on site, and there was not enough time for someone to have made it up another couple of flights of stairs between me seeing the shadow and the rope dropping. And perhaps more importantly, if there was someone creeping around on the floor directly above us, how on earth didn't we hear them?
At the time, I didn't realise Lil may have had her first paranormal encounter of the evening, and it wasn't until we reached our next destination that I finally found the path of weird. In fact, after the Great Hall and the theatrics in the stairway, as well as the quite heavy press of people around us, I was beginning to think that the evening would be a wash, and I wouldn't have much to talk about. However, as is our habit, Lil and I hung back at the tail end of the crowd as they pressed up the stairs. It was incredibly noisy as everyone's clumping footsteps reverberated on the springy wooden staircase like a herd of cattle being driven across a theatre stage. Even lagging behind, the stairs creaked and groaned as we walked up, followed only by the member of staff trailing as quietly as possible behind us. Anyone taking these stairs would make a bit of a racket, and so whoever cast the shadow Lil had seen would surely have been given away by the noise. Not that I knew about that at the time, but I was suddenly finding that as I reached the landing, a pressure was building on my head, much like someone placing a hand on each of my temples and squeezing. Not enough to be painful, but a definite pressure nonetheless. The pressure dissipated as we entered the great dining room. Last one's in and a bit of a tight squeeze, I leaned over slightly to whisper to Lil about the pressure I'd felt a few seconds before, only to find that the hairs on my arms were now standing up, and I had a rather strong feeling of both a presence and being watched coming from the dimly lit and shadowy dining room. Where the tour up until this point had been brightly lit, presumably for our own safety in climbing the stairs, the dining room was lit only with a few electric candles, and those were mainly behind us, leaving the room very dim and cloaked in shadow. I was virtually ignoring our guide at this point as he boomed out his patter. It seemed that he was perhaps more used to stage performances, where his volume would reach those up in the stands, but it was a little less suited to the more intimate setting of a ghost tour. I actually felt sorry for those stood immediately next to him, as I suspect their ears were ringing as much as if they'd been to a rock concert instead. Luckily, I have a gift for tuning things out, and my attention was focused entirely on tracing the source of my unease. I was first drawn to the centre of the dining table, where I had the feeling that something was sitting behind the centrepiece and keeping an eye on us. The centrepiece itself was a replica of a peacock pie, complete with a poor bird's head and brightly coloured tail feathers, which fanned out in a gaudy display, making somewhat of a shadowy screen for something to lurk behind. I even had the strange feeling that it had noticed me looking. Most of the group were of course looking at the guide, so I think that other than perhaps Lil, I was the only one really looking around the room. At this point, I hadn't actually seen anything that I could positively say was unusual. But you know that feeling you get when you lock eyes with someone across a room? Not in the romantic way, more in the sense that you were both idly looking around and suddenly found yourselves staring uncomfortably at each other. Still not actually seeing anything there, and just getting the impression that I was making whatever it was uncomfortable. My eyes were then drawn to a doorway at the back of the room that hadn't previously demanded my attention. I still got the impression that whatever it was at the table was looking at me, but it seemed more curious now than uncomfortable. In the doorway, however, I now kept seeing movement. I initially expected that, much like the rope dropping from the top of the staircase earlier, that there was an accomplice hidden in the next room, waiting for some cue to jump into or throw something into the room to the great surprise of everyone except me. The longer I watched, though, the more I thought that it might indeed be something stranger. It was dark in that part of the room, and whatever it was also dark or black, including what I assumed was the head. It seemed a little over the top for the staff to dress in a full-body onesie including the head, and it was also very low to the ground. I know that I couldn't bend that low and still just poke my head and shoulders around the door, as I'm not particularly flexible, but at my guess it would have been in the region of 2 foot tall. It also seemed to move unnaturally quickly and oddly in a way that is difficult to describe, and I knew then that it was what we've come to call a skitterer that I was seeing. I kept my eye on it for as long as possible until we were gently herded into the next room, but it seemed to do little more than keep peeking around the door as if waiting for us to leave before it felt comfortable enough to cross the room. From the great dining room, we walked down a small corridor and into the orange chamber, which is a bedroom. It is still laid out that way, with a 4-poster bed taking up most of the room and a small writing desk beside it. Our tour guide commenced his grand oratory as we were again the last to enter the room other than the member of staff who was diligently following along, locking up the rooms behind us. I didn't really feel much in this room other than having a feeling that I'd have liked to have been able to explore the small area behind the writing desk, and it wasn't until we were leaving the room that I had a very strong feeling. As usual, we dilly-dallied a little so that we would have the room pretty much to ourselves for a few moments, but as we went to leave and began to walk around the bed, I was suddenly overcome by dizziness. It was very strong and came on incredibly suddenly. It was all I could do to put one foot in front of the other without falling, and I was concerned that I was about to be struck down with a migraine or something. I had a rush of panic thoughts like, I think I'm going to fall. I think I might be sick. They'll think I'm drunk and kick us out. How am I going to drive home? Lil's never driven the coffee-mobile. And I was just about to whisper to Lil that it might be a good idea to have a quiet word with the person locking up behind us to see if there was somewhere I could sit for a few minutes and clear my head, when we stepped into the next room and the feeling vanished. I couldn't say if the feeling was in any way supernatural, but it was very strange how it came on so powerfully and went immediately on leaving the room. I don't remember our tour guide mentioning anything that might correlate to the feeling I had, but it did bring to mind an excerpt from the guidebook. It's a quote from the son of a 19th century custodian of the hall. The quote describes Aston Hall as a place full of noises, sounds, and strange airs, creating many uncanny situations. Again, this is just dropped on the page with absolutely no apparent reason or context, and perhaps it's just that my brain's permanently full of the paranormal, but I have to wonder if the author is referring to something supernatural here, despite there being no such mention of anything of the sort in the rest of the page or related text. As I read through this guidebook, I start to feel like I'm reading into it, like you would an English lit book, as though there are hidden clues and subtext in there for me to find. Perhaps it's just very haphazardly written, but I can't help puzzling over some of the things that have been included with no explanation. The next section of the tour was perhaps the most disappointing for me. We were squished into a tiny room just off the orange room as the tour guide told tales of banshees and ghosts amongst other things. A member of our group, perhaps a little drunkenly, attempted to liven up the tour even further by knocking on a piece of furniture, which earned him a swift reprimand from our guide due to said furniture being several hundred years old. Shortly after this, the guide, with no further explanation, simply said that everything he had just told us was all made up and we should follow him to the next area. Considering that one of the first things out of his mouth at the start of the tour was, "Believe it or not, everything I tell you tonight is absolutely true," it was a bit of a slap in the face. At least on further research, it did seem that pretty much everything else he mentioned was written in historical records, or at the very least in local legend. The group hurried through the next few rooms, and I was to face yet further disappointment that we were unable to linger here, as the next room was the King Charles bedroom, and it was humming. I've mentioned before as to how I get a kind of tinnitus sound in my ears if there's something electrical on nearby, or when there's something unusual happening, and here it felt like a flashbang had gone off. My hearing was all but reduced to a keen, high-pitched ringing, and the hairs on the back of my arms and neck stood to attention. Though the room now is laid out with pieces of armour and other Civil War artefacts, it was originally, as the name suggests, the room in which King Charles stayed the night, shortly before the Battle of Edge Hill. It was as if the room itself and everything in it was charged, and I think I would have preferred little else that night than to be left in that room alone for the remainder of the tour. It was not to be, however, as we were rushed by several rooms. The path we had taken looped back on our earlier route, and I found myself having another strong feeling as we approached yet another doorway. I mentioned this to Lil as we walked through it, and found ourselves in the dining room again, only this time we were stood in the very spot I had seen the skitterer earlier. my senses then apparently picking up residual energy from our little shadow friend that we'd seen earlier on the tour. In fact, that wasn't the only odd thing we felt in that area, though we only found out discussing it later and preparing for the show. Both Lil and I seem to remember passing 2 rooms before reaching the dining room again, but looking at the site plan from the guidebook, there's only 1. Now, considering the guidebook doesn't exactly seem to be quite the authority on the hall that you'd like it to be, we don't know if this is an error in the house plan or not, although we haven't been able to find anything online about a second room either. If it was just me, I'd be more willing to write it off as the fallibility of memory, but we both distinctly remember passing through 2 rooms. I can't help but think that maybe the Civil War artifacts in the King Charles room were partly responsible for the seemingly heightened energy in there. Of course, all the rooms had historical artifacts in them, even if it was just the furniture, but the items in here were overwhelmingly military, with helmets and armour that may have been used on the 17th century battlefield. The house itself still bears the scars of Civil War fighting. A shattered newel post on the Great Stairs tells the story of an attack by parliamentarian forces in December of 1643. Perhaps all these connections to the Civil War combined with the artifacts is creating a perfect storm, especially adding in the fact that King Charles would have tossed and turned all night in this very room, surely thinking and planning and worrying about the battle at Edge Hill, a battle that itself has spawned many ghost stories and paranormal sightings.
It wasn't just Fitz who felt the crazy energy of the King Charles room either. I found it pretty overwhelming myself. The path of weird was very strong here indeed, and I almost laughed out loud when we popped out in the very doorway in the great dining room where Fitz had told me he'd seen something shadowy peeking out. I'd had no idea that's where we were headed back to, so to discover that the electric-y vibes I'd been feeling build up and up all arrived at the point Fitz had been seeing things, it just made so much sense that I wanted to chuckle to myself. Apparently blissfully unaware of any of this, our guide hurried us on to our next destination, which, he proudly boasted, was where the spooky things really started to happen. I was a little sceptical, but I could instantly see why this room in particular inspired feelings of both awe and strangeness, as the next room was the Long Gallery, and it was truly spectacular. As we entered, our guide told us that this is where lots of visitors get weird feelings, and that the room is always freezing cold. It did have a bit of an odd feeling to it, and it certainly was cold. But more than anything, it was just an overwhelming space to look at, running the entire length of the house at 136 feet long. The gallery was an amazing sight. As we settled here for a while, everyone trying not to fidget because it made the floorboards creak and groan so much it drowned out the guide, we were told of a ghostly encounter that occurred in the 1800s when James Watt Jr. and his family occupied Aston Hall. Of course, in those days, children were seen and not heard, by their parents at least, so when James Watt Jr.'s sons had an experience with one of Aston's resident ghosts, it was the boy's nanny who reported it. One day, the 2 boys were playing in the Long Gallery, and their nanny, coming to fetch them, was heading towards the gallery, listening to the sounds of the children playing, when her ears pricked up and she realised she could hear a girl's voice as well as those of the 2 boys. Confused, she quickened her pace, but as the children came into view, there was no little girl to be seen. The nanny asked the boys, "Where did the little girl go?" "Through there," came the reply, and the boys pointed to a solid section of oak panelling in the middle of the gallery, implying that the girl had simply vanished into the wall. Now it just so happened that I was standing right in front of this section of panelling. Trust me to be standing right in the haunted bit. although sadly I can't say I noticed anything unusual feeling about the area. To me, although I certainly could feel a bit of an atmosphere in the gallery, it wasn't any greater here than in the rest of the house. The perpetual cold could very simply be explained by the huge expanse of the room, the high ceiling, the tall and draughty windows, and the large fireplace with wind whistling down the chimney. Even the layout of the room was rather conducive to making one feel slightly odd. The gallery is quite astonishingly long, and in the dark, with the moonlight streaming in through the windows, with their ancient warped glass, everything cast weird shadows. The hall stretched off into the distant gloom, and the dark panelling all the way up to the ceiling did nothing to lift the darkness. It was a very odd space. There were no internal walls, or even much furniture to break up the long room, and everything about it should have been angular, but the intricate curling plasterwork on the ceiling, and the warped and undulating floorboards that seemed to lap the floor like darkly oaken waves, gave everything a weird funhouse effect that made me think of being in a Van Gogh painting. Apparently, visitors often feel something brush past them with a swishing noise that reminds them of crinoline skirts. And our tour guide admitted that he'd once experienced what felt like a small child running through his legs in this room. I'd be fascinated to stand in this room without the crowd, maybe even close my eyes to block out the optical illusion quality of the room, and just wait quietly to see if I felt anything brush past me. Unfortunately, though, there was no opportunity to do that this time, as we were soon hustled along to another staircase to climb higher to the top of the house and the attic rooms. So up we creaked and cracked and groaned up what felt like several more flights of deafeningly loud stairs, and the further up we went, the more anxious I began to feel. First, I felt a change in the atmosphere and a tingly electric feeling, which is quite common for me, but as we neared the attic, I started to feel agitated, breathless, tight-chested, heart-racing, and I must point out here that I'm perfectly fit enough for the climb up the stairs not to cause any adverse effects, but it was definitely an anxious, agitated feeling. I did wonder if for some reason I was starting to have some panic attack symptoms, but on the flip side, I was somehow pretty sure it wasn't coming from me. It was at its worst when we reached the top of the staircase in front of the servants' quarters, and oddly, this is where Fitz saw something behind a closed door on the landing.
This was where, more so than in the other rooms, that it was made all too obvious that our group was too large. Even had I wanted to go into the attic room that was the climax of the tour, there was simply no space. At this point, I was left outside the room on the stairs, and with the lack of light in the attic, all I could see was the backs of the people immediately in front of me, and beyond that, simply darkness. I expect that with the press of people, even if there had been something in the room, I shouldn't have sensed it anyway. Instead, I let my eyes roam around my surroundings. Oddly, the staircase forked at the landing below, but the second staircase appeared to be sectioned off. The banister literally continued across the fork and blocked the second staircase. I couldn't tell from this position if there was some mechanism to open it, but it stood out to me as odd. If there was no way to open the route up, you would have had to have hopped over the banister to climb the second smaller staircase, which led to an old wooden door. It was rough-hewn and open just a crack, but there were quite large gaps between the boards, certainly large enough to wiggle a few fingers through, that ran the length of the door. There was a dim light coming from inside the room, and I presumed that there was another entrance to it from the attic room, and that we'd be passing through it as part of the tour. As I was looking at the door, I saw someone pass behind it, the light showing through the cracks being blocked as the figure passed by. I again assumed that this was simply a member of staff waiting to perform another jump scare. But in the end, our route was never to lead us that way at all. The member of staff trailing behind us, ushering us on so they could get home to their dinner, were, as you might expect, still behind us, and a later sneaky peek from me in the attic didn't reveal any alternative access to the room in which I'd seen someone move. Just as with Lil's staircase sighting, it was only later that it dawned on me that practically every footstep one takes in this house is loudly announced by the reverberant ancient timber flooring, but the figure I had seen had made not so much as a peep.
Although we couldn't see much at first beyond the press of bodies, this was apparently Dick's garret where the servant boy had supposedly hung himself, although it was another story that we'd come up here to be told. It was also the only room where we were allowed to use our mobile phones, as supposedly it was possible to see a strange dancing light in the far corner of the room through some camera phones. It seems as though one or two members of the group could pick up a mysterious light on their cameras, although Fitz and I saw nothing, and I'd be interested to see the room in daylight to discover what was in the corner of the room and if there was anything that could have caused it. I also have to wonder how they discovered it when visitors on the tour aren't allowed to take pictures on their camera phones. The cause of this mysterious light, so we're told, may be the sad shade of one of Thomas Holt's daughters, Elizabeth. It wasn't only Holt's sons who ran into trouble with their father over their marriage choices. Elizabeth fell in love with a man whom Holt severely disapproved of, so much so that it's said he locked Elizabeth away in an attic room for 16 years. It's also said that she never left that room alive. There are various versions of the story. One says that she tried to make an escape, tripped, and fell to her death down the stairs. Another that she flung herself out of the high window in desperation. Often it's told that she refused food in an act of rebellion and eventually starved to death. None of these stories seem to end well for poor Elizabeth, so it's understandable why so many of the strange occurrences that happen on these top floors are attributed to her unhappy spirit. Now, there seems to be some lack of consensus over exactly where Elizabeth was locked up and where the servant boy took his life. I could have sworn that the guide said the garret was the room where Elizabeth Holt was locked up, and that the servant boy hung himself in a room just over to the left. But in that case, it wouldn't really make sense that the room is known as Dick's garret. Most reports place this as the room of the hanging, but some also cite it as being the place of Elizabeth's confinement, whilst others say she was locked in one of the tower rooms. Still others seem to imply that the rooms to the left of the garret room include the housekeeper's room, where the lady in the green dress is often sighted. It all gets very confusing, and I'd love to visit again one day, in the daylight and with much more time and not being shooed along on a tour, to try and piece all the parts of the puzzle together properly, because the more I looked into these stories, the more questions I seemed to come up with. But something that is, without question it seems, whether it's the apparition of Elizabeth or someone else entirely, is that visitors and staff alike do see the phantom form of a woman flitting around the attic rooms. Traditionally, these are reported as Grey Lady sightings, but I came across a more recent account from a visitor who had seen the ghostly shadow of a lady in one of these upstairs rooms, although it wasn't quite clear which room. She was surprised by the dark shape of a woman crossing the room, which instantly sent chills up and down her body. Having turned to tell her husband what she'd seen, the figure passed the couple again, and this time her husband saw it too. Despite being an avid non-believer, he could find no explanation for what they'd just seen, and left shaken and wondering.
We were now required to retrace our steps somewhat And due to the press of people in the attic room and our habit of hanging back, this now meant that we were at the front of the pack, as we were led back through various stairways and hallways until we reached the kitchen on the ground floor. We appeared to have lost a large part of our group traversing the building, and so there was only a handful of us to enter the kitchen at first, which was again very dimly lit. We'd let a handful of people pass us on the way, and there were perhaps 4 or 5 other people in the kitchen already, gathering in front of a large round table, with a member of staff stood on a gentle ramp on the far side of the room. Finding our places, I nearly bumped into somebody to my left who I'd not noticed at first, as they were almost entirely cloaked in shadow. A few moments later, and after a little shuffling to let more people into the room, I felt something brush against my leg. Looking down, I saw a small rope sectioning off the backside of the room, which I hadn't originally noticed in the dark. Expecting to see either a member of staff or a mannequin, I turned back to where I'd seen the figure, only to find the area completely empty. If anyone had been standing there, they would either have had to have moved us to clamber over the rope, or would have walked around the back of the table and been clearly visible. They had, in fact, vanished. I found this very strange, as I had no inkling that this was anything other than a person, and I was ready to dismiss missing whoever it was moving out from behind the table, until the rest of the group filed in, and our tour guide entered the roped-off area, and stood precisely where I'd seen the figure. Only this time he was clearly visible. Stood in a gloomy room, yes. He was clearly visible as a person, and his features were defined, far more real than the shadowy shape I nearly apologised to moments before. Our tour ended rather abruptly after this, and somewhat disappointedly we left to begin the journey home. That isn't to say that Aston Hall isn't worth a visit, as it surely is, but for all the atmosphere that a nighttime ghost tour might inspire, the reality was a touch too overdramatic and rushed. As I said before, the strongest feelings that I'd had all night were in rooms that were not even paused in to mention, and the size of our group was far too large to foster the intimate and sinister atmosphere I was expecting, and indeed even too large to fit all of us in many of the rooms at once. Our recommendation would be to visit during the day, when we suspect that you'll have a little more leisure to explore the building, and hopefully less of the pressing crowd to deal with.
So there we go, guys. We do hope you enjoyed our paranormal postcard adventure to Aston Hall, despite the fact that we did find a few elements of the tour a little bit disappointing. But the fact is, we had a ton of experiences. The hall itself is magnificent. I would love to visit again in the day. I do hope I get the chance to at some point, especially the long gallery. It was just, I want to get back in and explore.
There is a sense in that room. I didn't get anything sort of spooky from it, but the moment you feel like a hobbit when you walk in, because everything is just such a grand scale.
Yep.
And it's, like you're a hobbit or you're in Gulliver's Travels or something.
And I'd also have loved to look out of those windows sort of onto the lawn in daylight, because I think the purpose of that room originally, it was built that long so that the family could take their perambulations, basically have an exercise when it was wet outside.
Oh, right.
And I imagine that on a rainy day, walking up and down that hall, looking out the window, I kind of
sounded like a herd of elephants traipsing up and down the house, though. I couldn't get over how noisy the place was.
It was one of the loudest floors I've ever encountered.
Yeah, if you've got a squeaky floorboard at home, imagine that, times it by 10, and then beat it with a sledgehammer, and then every single footstep was that.
Coming back to that for a second, actually, I just wanted to clarify a little bit, because it was at the time when we were having the experience of seeing the shadow figures, when I saw the shadow figure on the landing, and then when you saw the shadow figure in one of the attic rooms, we kind of just didn't realise how significant that was at the time. But when I was writing up all the notes and going back through what we experienced, I was trying to sort of account for all the staff. So when we started the tour, there was our tour guide at the front.
Mm-hmm.
There was a member of the tour staff at the back,
Yeah.
sort of mopping up, as it were. Now, once the noose had been thrown from the staircase, the member of staff at the back came up the stairs with us, and basically, I didn't see them come down, but when we got upstairs, a third member of staff, the one who had thrown the rope from wherever they'd thrown it, had come down to meet us. And at that point, those two members of staff switched.
Yeah.
One of them went back down the stairs and presumably exited to lock up all that, the sort of great hall and the front door. And the one who'd thrown the rope then continued with us for the rest of the tour. So that first member of staff, we never saw them again. And the member of staff that had joined us and then became the last one to lock up did exactly that. They locked all the rooms, every room we went in, they locked behind us. So I'm fairly certain that there were only two members of staff. Look, at the point you saw the shadow figure in the attic, I think it was just the tour guide and the one at the back. So I don't think there was a third member of staff. Like, obviously, we don't know that for sure, but it's just, you're trying to account for everything in your head and think, could it have been a person?
Nothing else happened. Like, if something had been thrown or someone had knocked on a wall or if something else had happened, I'd have been like, oh yeah, it was them.
But the rope, I mean, when I started going up the stairs and realised how far up it went, I mean, it seemed to go just right to the top of the building. I don't know where they threw it from, but it was, well, it certainly wasn't the landing that I saw a shadow figure on. So, yeah, I mean, we can't really put all the pieces together. And the whole thing with the weird bits in the guidebook and the strange legends that seem to have been deliberately swept under the carpet, it's all just, it's a mystery.
It is. It's a very weird place.
But one that I would highly recommend going. Probably in the day, though.
Yeah, just in the daytime.
I'm not trying to discourage anybody from going on ghost tours. I think part of the problem for us was that the last place we went to was Oxford Castle, and the tour they did there was amazing, and it kind of ruined us for any other tours. I think the ghost tour they'd put on at Aston Hall was really, it was geared towards locals who'd probably been to the hall 100 times. They'd already seen all the rooms, and this was just an opportunity to see it at night with a different kind of atmosphere. And if that was the case, it would have been fantastic. But unfortunately, we weren't locals. So, and Oxford Castle had done such a magnificent job, even though it wasn't a ghost tour. It kind of, they just ruined us a bit, didn't they?
Yeah, being able to just wander around after the tour was over was a big sell for me for Oxford Castle.
So, yeah, if you know of any amazing ghost tours that in the Midlands where we might get the perfect ghost tour that we're looking for, please do let us know.
So we'll look forward to hearing your recommendations. And I'm afraid that is all we have time for this episode. Thank you again to everyone that shared their paranormal stories with us. Remember that if you've got a paranormal story to share, please do get in touch through the website at knockOncevs.com. Even if you don't have a story to share, actually, do check out the website anyway, as we occasionally put up an interesting blog post, like the one on the ghost of Woodford Church. And it has links to all of our other social media channels as well. Would also like to thank our patrons again, without whom we couldn't afford to keep producing the show. And if you'd like to help support Knock Once for Yes, do please consider becoming our patron. And not only will you help us keep making the show and visiting haunted locations to share with you, you'll also get access to some bonus content, like the video we mentioned earlier about our trip to Aston Hall. And again, if you do sign up, apologies for the singing. We'll try not to do it again. All our bonus content's available to all our patrons, which starts from $1 a month. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and coming up next episode, we're really excited to tell you about some of the paranormal investigation that we've been up to. So, we hope you'll join us again next time for another Knock Once for Yes.